The ridge world had no name, only a number on a chart, and beside that number was a red mark that every pilot in the galaxy understood. Stay away. Daniel Reyes had read that mark 100 times during his years of surveying empty rocks at the edge of known space. He had never planned to ignore it. The plan, like most of his plans, fell apart the moment his shuttle's main thruster tore itself loose in the upper atmosphere. He fought the controls all the way down. The little craft screamed through clouds the color of rust, and the ground came up fast, a wall of stone ridges and deep green valleys. Daniel pulled hard on the stick, killed what power he had left, and aimed for the flattest patch he could find. The landing was less a landing and more a long, grinding crash. Metal shrieked. The world spun. Then everything stopped. For a while he just sat there, breathing, listening to his own heart. The cockpit was cracked but holding. His arm hurt and a thin line of blood ran down his temple, but he was alive. That was more than the red mark on the chart had promised. When he finally pushed the hatch open and climbed out, he understood why no one came here. He had landed in the Forbidden Range, the Dragon Range. Every species that crossed the stars knew the rule. You did not approach dragons. The older races, the ones who had been flying between worlds for thousands of years, told it to their young like a warning carved in stone. Dragons were not animals. They were not beasts to be hunted or tamed. They were something older and colder, intelligent in a way that made your skin crawl, and they shared their worlds with no one. Every recorded attempt to make contact had ended the same way. The diplomats never came back. The soldiers never came back. The scientists with their gifts and their machines never came back. After enough deaths, the galaxy simply drew a red line around the dragon worlds and agreed, quietly, to leave them alone forever. And now a human sat in a wrecked shuttle in the middle of one of those worlds. Daniel did not let himself panic. Panic was for people with options. He had a broken ship, a busted arm, and no rescue coming, because no rescue ship in its right mind would fly into this range. So he did the only thing he knew how to do. He took stock. The shuttle was finished. The thruster was gone and the hull was split, but the storage lockers had survived. He had a water recycler, ration packs for maybe 3 weeks, a medical kit, a cutting tool, his survey scanner, and a thermal blanket. He had a sidearm too, though he laughed at himself for even thinking it. If a dragon found him, a sidearm would be like throwing pebbles at a mountain. He cleaned the cut on his head, set his arm in a brace, and ate half a ration bar while the strange sun sank behind the ridges. The light here was thick and orange, and the air smelled of stone and something faintly burnt. Far off he could see shapes circling high in the sky, slow and patient, riding the warm currents. He did not need the scanner to know what they were. He watched them until the dark came, and then he climbed back inside the broken cockpit and did not sleep much at all. The first day, nothing happened. He stayed close to the wreck, patched what he could, and tried to raise anyone on the long-range comm. There was only static. He was deep in a range that ships avoided, on a world that had no listening posts, and the distress beacon he set up felt like shouting into a cave. The second day, he started to think about distance. If no one would fly in to get him, he would have to survive long enough to find another way out. That meant water, food, and shelter that would last longer than 3 weeks. He took his scanner and walked a careful circle around the crash site, never going far, always keeping the wreck in sight. The valley was beautiful and empty. Tall grass moved in the wind. A stream ran cold and clear over black rocks. He filled his recycler and let himself feel one small, foolish flicker of hope. It was on the third day that he found the cave. It was not really a cave, more a deep hollow worn into the base of a cliff, half hidden behind a curtain of hanging vines. He almost walked right past it, but something made him stop. A sound, faint at first then clearer. A dry, scraping crack like stone splitting coming from inside the hollow. Daniel froze. Every instinct he had told him to turn around, walk back to the wreck, and never come near this place again. The red mark on the chart flashed in his mind. Stay away. He had broken that rule by crashing here, but he did not have to break it any further. He could leave. He should leave. The sound came again, crack, and under it something else. A small, thin sound that he could not name, almost like a cry. His feet did not move toward the wreck, they moved toward the vines. He told himself he was only going to look. He told himself he would back away the moment he understood what he was hearing. He pushed the hanging vines aside with the barrel of his scanner and leaned into the dark hollow, his eyes slowly adjusting, his breath held tight in his chest. And in the dim orange light that crept in behind him, Daniel Reyes saw what was waiting in the dark, and he understood that the red mark on the chart had never told the whole truth. The hollow was a nest. Daniel stood very still and let his eyes take it in. The floor was lined with dry grass and what looked like shed scales, dull and gray. In the center sat a cluster of eggs, each one larger than his head, their shells the color of old bone. He counted 7. 6 of them were cracked open and empty, but not in the way a hatching leaves an egg. These had collapsed inward, dry and hollow, the life inside them long gone. Whatever had been in those 6 eggs had died before it ever drew breath. The 7th egg was moving. It rocked back and forth in the grass, and along its surface ran a thin split that grew longer as he watched. Crack! A piece of shell broke away and fell. Through the gap, something pushed and strained, and the thin crying sound came again, weaker now, like a thing that had been fighting for a long time and was running out of strength. Daniel knew he should leave. This was a dragon nest, and these were dragon eggs, and the only law the galaxy held about dragons was that you never, ever came this close. But he could not make himself walk away from a creature trying so hard to live. He had pulled men out of crashed pods. He had dragged a wounded partner across half a desert moon once, years ago. Some part of him simply did not know how to turn his back on a thing that was struggling. So he crouched and he watched and he waited. The egg gave one last violent shake and the top of it broke open. A small head pushed through, wet and trembling. The hatchling was tiny, far smaller than he had imagined a dragon could be, no bigger than a house cat. Its scales were a deep, dark green, almost black and slick with the fluid of the egg. 2 little wings, folded and crumpled, clung to its back. It blinked up at the dim light with enormous eyes, gold and round, and those eyes found Daniel and locked onto him. He held his breath. The hatchling looked at the 6 dead eggs around it. Then it looked back at Daniel. It was alone. Its clutch was gone, every brother and sister cold in the shell, and the adults who should have been here were nowhere in the hollow. The little creature was the only living thing born from this nest, and the first warm, breathing shape its eyes had ever settled on was a human. It opened its small mouth and made the crying sound again, and this time it was aimed at him. Daniel did not move. He understood in a slow and frightening way what was happening. He had read about this in old survey files, the way certain creatures bond to the first living thing they see. He had not known dragons did it. He had not known dragons did anything that ordinary. But the hatchling was crawling now, dragging itself out of the broken shell, wobbling on legs that did not yet work right, and it was crawling straight toward him. "No," he said softly, lifting his hands. "No, no, I'm not your kind, you don't want me." The hatchling did not understand the words, or did not care. It reached the edge of the grass, tumbled over a fallen piece of shell, picked itself up, and kept coming. It bumped into his boot and pressed its small, wet head against the leather and made a low, contented sound, a sort of rumble that vibrated through his foot. Daniel's heart was pounding. Every part of him screamed that the adults would return, that they would find a human crouched over their last living young, and that there would be no standoff, no chance to explain, only a quick and final end. He had to put distance between himself and this nest. He had to leave the hatchling and go. He stood up slowly. The little dragon looked up at him with those huge gold eyes and gave a thin, frightened cry, as if it already knew he meant to walk away. He took one step back. The hatchling stumbled after him. He took another. It followed, falling, rising, following again, refusing to be left behind. "Stop," he whispered. "Please, you have to stay here. Your family will come back for you." But even as he said it, he looked at the 6 dead eggs and the empty nest and the dust on the grass that said no adult had tended this place in days, and he knew it was a lie. No one was coming back for this one. It had been left to hatch alone or not at all. He stopped backing away. The hatchling caught up to him and pressed against his boot again, shivering. It was cold. The fluid from the egg was drying on its scales and it was shaking from it. Without quite deciding to, Daniel knelt down. He pulled the thermal blanket from his pack, the one good blanket he had, and very carefully, very slowly, he wrapped the tiny creature in it. The hatchling stopped shaking. It burrowed into the warmth and looked up at him, and the low rumble started again, steady and trusting. "This is a mistake," Daniel said quietly. "You know that, right? This is a very big mistake." The hatchling closed its eyes and went asleep against his chest. He stayed there in the hollow, holding a sleeping dragon, listening to the wind. For a long moment there was peace, strange and fragile, a thing he had not expected to feel on this red-marked world. Then he heard it, a sound far off and growing closer, a heavy, rhythmic beat, like enormous sails snapping in a storm. Wing beats, many of them, coming fast. The adults were returning. Daniel scrambled out of the hollow with the hatchling still wrapped against his chest, and there was no time to run. The sky above the valley had filled with dragons. They came down out of the orange light in a great spiral, wings wide enough to throw shadows across the whole crash site, scales flashing dark green and bronze and deep red. There were 6 of them, then 8, then more. They landed around the cliff in a ring, claws tearing the grass, and the ground shook with the weight of them. Up close they were nothing like the slow shapes he had watched circling at a distance. They were vast. The smallest was the size of his wrecked shuttle. The largest could have swallowed it whole. Daniel did not reach for his sidearm. He knew how useless it would be, and more than that, he knew that any sudden move would end this in a heartbeat. He stood as still as he could with the hatchling clutched to him, and he waited to die. The largest dragon stepped forward. Its scales were the deep red of dried blood, and a long scar ran across its snout, an old wound from some battle Daniel could not imagine. Its eyes were the same gold as the hatchling's, but ancient, sharp, and full of a cold intelligence that pinned him in place. It lowered its enormous head until its breath washed over him, hot and smelling of smoke. A low sound rolled out of its throat, and Daniel understood without any words that it was rage. He had trespassed. He had touched their young. There was only one way this ended. The red dragon opened its mouth. He could see the glow building deep in its throat, the heat of it, the promise of fire. And then the hatchling moved. It tore free of the blanket and dropped to the grass, and on its wobbling, newborn legs it scrambled around in front of Daniel and planted itself between him and the towering red dragon. It spread its tiny crumpled wings as wide as they would go, a creature the size of a house cat trying to shield a full-grown man from a monster. It threw back its small head, and out of its mouth came a sound that froze every dragon in the ring. "Papa." The word was clumsy and high and cracked, shaped by a throat never meant for human speech, but it was unmistakable. It was a human word. The hatchling had heard nothing in its short life but Daniel's quiet voice in the hollow, his soft "no, no," and his whispered "please." And somewhere in those few minutes it had learned what he was to it and had found the word for it in his own tongue. "Papa," it said again, louder, and pressed back against Daniel's leg, refusing to move. The red dragon went still. The glow in its throat faded. The whole ring of dragons had gone silent, and Daniel could feel something passing between them, some shock that ran through the group like a current. He did not understand it then, but he understood that everything had changed. No dragon had ever spoken a soft species word. The galaxy believed dragons did not lower themselves to such things, that they were too proud, too cold, too far above the chattering younger races. But here was a newborn, hours old, speaking a human word and using it to name a human as kin. And no dragon, not in all their long and bitter history, had ever seen a hatchling stand between its own kind and an outsider to protect that outsider with its body. The red dragon drew its head back slowly. It looked at the hatchling for a long time. Then it looked at Daniel, and the rage in its eyes had given way to something else, something Daniel could not read, confusion and grief and a strange, dawning thought all at once. It made a low sound, and one of the smaller dragons came forward, this one a softer green, moving with care. It lowered its head near the hatchling and breathed in its scent, and the hatchling chirped at it but did not leave Daniel's side. It would not be coaxed away. When the green dragon nudged it gently back toward the nest, the little creature dug its claws into Daniel's boot and cried out, the same thin, desperate cry it had made when he tried to walk away in the hollow. The dragons understood that sound. Daniel watched them understand it. Whatever law these creatures lived by, the bond a hatchling formed was something they could not simply break. The little one had chosen, and it had chosen him, and to tear it away would be to break something sacred to them. The red dragon lifted its head and let out a long, low call that rolled across the valley. The other dragons answered. Then it turned its ancient gold eyes back to Daniel, and it did something no human had ever lived to report. It stepped aside. The ring opened. The way back toward his wreck stood clear. Daniel did not move at first. He did not trust it. But the hatchling tugged at him, looking up, and slowly, carefully, he bent and gathered the little dragon back into his arms. The red dragon watched him do it. It did not attack. It only watched with that strange new look in its eyes as the human it had come to kill stood unharmed in the middle of the roost holding their last living young. For the first time in the long memory of dragons, a human had approached, and the dragons had let him live. Daniel held the hatchling close, his heart still hammering, and met the red dragon's gaze. Neither of them looked away. And in that silence, under that orange sky, something began that neither species had any name for yet. They did not send Daniel away, and they did not let him go back to his wreck alone. The red dragon, the one with the scar, walked beside him as he carried the hatchling up the ridge, and the others followed in a slow procession that ended at the roost. The roost was a wide bowl of stone high in the cliffs, open to the sky, warmed by vents that breathed heat up from deep underground. Dragons of every size rested there, and when Daniel arrived with the hatchling in his arms, every one of them turned to look. He expected fear or fury or both. Instead, he felt something heavier. He felt grief. It took him many days to understand it, and the hatchling was the key. The little one grew fast, faster than any creature he had ever seen. Within a week it was the size of a large dog, and its clumsy speech sharpened. It still called him Papa, and it began to learn other human words from him, simple ones, repeating them back in its cracked young voice. But it could also speak to the adults, and slowly it became a bridge between Daniel and the dragons, carrying meaning back and forth in a way no diplomat in galactic history had ever managed. Through the hatchling and through patience, and through long quiet hours of watching, Daniel began to learn the truth. The galaxy thought it knew dragons. The galaxy was wrong. The fear, the red marks on the charts, the rule that no one approached, all of it rested on a story everyone believed and no one had ever questioned. Dragons were monsters. Dragons killed anything that came near. Dragons wanted only to be left alone in their cruelty. But it was not cruelty, it was a wound. Long ago, the hatchling told him in its broken way, and the scarred red dragon confirmed it with images Daniel slowly learned to read in its eyes and its low sounds. The dragons had not lived alone. They had been many, spread across many worlds, a people as much as a species, with songs and memory and a history that stretched back further than any of the younger races could count. And then an empire had come. It came from far across the dark, an empire of cold builders who saw the dragon worlds and wanted them. They wanted the heat that breathed up from beneath the stone, the rare metals in the ridges, the open skies. And they decided that the dragons were in the way. So they hunted them, not for sport, not in war as the dragons understood war, but as a thing to be cleared, like clearing a forest to lay a road. Ship after ship came, with weapons the dragons had no answer for, and world after world fell silent. Dragons fought. They burned. They died. And in the end, the few who survived fled to the deepest, hardest worlds, the ridge worlds no one wanted, and they built a wall. Not a wall of stone, but a wall of terror. They let the galaxy believe the worst of them. They killed every diplomat and soldier and scientist who came near, not out of hatred, but out of a desperate need to be left alone, to never again let an outsider learn how few they had become, how weak they truly were behind the legend. The red mark on the chart was a lie the dragons had built to protect the last of themselves. Daniel sat with this knowledge for a long time. He looked at the roost, at the dragons resting in the heat, and he counted them, and the number was small. Far too small for a whole people. He understood now why the nest in the hollow had held 6 dead eggs and 1 struggling life. The dragons were not the endless monsters the galaxy feared. They were a dying people, holding on by a thread, and the hatchling that had run to him was one of the very few new lives they had left. He thought about how the galaxy would react if it knew. He thought about other empires, other builders, who would see weakness instead of terror and come to finish what the first empire had started. And he kept that thought to himself, and he was afraid of it. The scarred red dragon, whose name in the dragon way meant something close to Last Watcher, came to trust him slowly. It would sit near him in the evenings while the hatchling slept curled against his side, and it would share its memories, and Daniel would share his own, his crashed ship, his lonely years of surveying, his own small human griefs. 2 survivors of different kinds, learning that they were not so different after all. One evening the hatchling pressed close to him and said, in its clearest human words yet, "You stay, Papa." Not a question, a hope. Daniel looked at the little creature, at the gold eyes that had chosen him, and at the dragons around the roost who had let a human into the last safe place they had in all the galaxy. He thought about his wrecked shuttle and his fatting beacon, and the rescue that was never coming, and he found he did not mind so much. "I'll stay," he said. The hatchling rumbled with joy and pressed its head under his chin. That night the peace held. The heat breathed up from the stone, and the dragons slept, and Daniel let himself believe that he had found something rare and good on this forbidden world. Then just before dawn a sound cut through the roost. It was a thin, electronic wail, rising and falling. It was coming from the direction of his wreck. It was a signal, not his beacon, something else, something incoming. The last watcher's head snapped up, and in its ancient gold eyes Daniel saw a fear he had never seen there before. The old empire had found them again. Daniel ran to his wreck with the last watcher gliding low overhead, and when he reached the cracked cockpit and pulled up the scanner, his blood went cold. The signal was a wideband scan sweep, the kind a survey fleet sent down before a landing. It was mapping the ridge world, counting the heat vents, marking the metals, and it was learning exactly how few dragons were left. The wall of terror the dragons had built for so long had finally failed. Someone had looked behind it and seen the truth. The ships came 2 days later. They came down out of the dark in cold gray columns, blunt and heavy, built for braking rather than flying. The empire of builders had not changed in all the long years. Daniel watched the first wave settle on the far ridges through his scanner, and he counted the landing craft and the dropships, and the squat weapon platforms they unfolded onto the stone. Against that, the dragons had their fire, their claws, their wings, and their small, dwindling numbers. He had seen the records of the old hunting. He knew how this ended if nothing changed. The dragons knew it too. They gathered in the roost, and there was no panic in them, only a heavy, ancient sorrow, the look of a people who had run as far as there was to run and had finally been caught. The last watcher meant to lead them out to meet the empire in the open sky, to die fighting as dragons died, and to buy the hatchlings, what few there were, a little time to scatter and hide. Daniel could not accept it. He was one human with a broken ship and a sidearm he had never even drawn, but he was also something the dragons were not. He was an outsider who understood the enemy's machines, their signals, their cold and orderly way of thinking. The dragons had never beaten the empire because the dragons had only ever fought it the way a storm fights, with fury and no plan. Daniel had spent his whole life reading machines and finding the weak seams in them. He climbed onto a high rock where the last watcher and the others could see him, and through the hatchling he made them understand. Do not meet them in the open. Do not give them the easy targets they expect. Let me show you another way. The dragons were proud, and the idea of taking the counsel of a soft species creature in war went against everything they were. But the last watcher looked at the human who had stayed, and at the hatchling that called him Papa, and it chose to listen. Daniel got to work. He stripped his wrecked shuttle down to its bones. The long-range comm became a tool to listen in on the Empire's own signals, and though he could not read their language, he could read the shape of their transmissions, the bursts before an attack, the steady pulse of their coordination. He learned to tell when they were about to move. He took the shuttle's power core and the cutting tool and built crude jammers, ugly things of wire and salvage, and he showed the dragons where to drop them among the ridges, so the Empire's machines would go blind and deaf at the worst moment. He studied the weapon platforms through the scanner until he understood them. They were built to fire upward, to swat dragons out of the sky as they had always done. So Daniel told the dragons not to fly high. He told them to come low and fast through the valleys, below the angle the guns could reach, using the very ridges as cover. It was the opposite of everything dragon instinct demanded. It worked. The first attack came at dawn. The Empire expected to find a few desperate creatures rising into their guns. Instead, the dragons stayed low, hidden, while Daniel's jammers swallowed the Empire's signals and threw their careful order into chaos. Confused, the weapon platforms fired at shadows. And then the dragons came, not from above but from the sides, bursting out of the valleys at ground level where the guns could not turn fast enough, tearing through the dropships before they could lift off. For the first time in their long history, the dragons were not the ones dying. Day after day the battle went on. Daniel barely slept. He moved his jammers, read the signals, found new weak seams, and fed everything to the dragons through the hatchling who would not leave his side. The little one had grown again, taller now than Daniel himself, and when it fought near him, shielding him from the stray fire that the Empire began to aim at the strange ground-bound creature directing the dragon's defense. They had realized that the human was the difference. They began to hunt him. The Empire learned and adapted. They brought down heavier ships, harder to blind, and they began to push through the valleys the dragons had used so well. The dragons grew tired. Their numbers, never large, dropped lower. Daniel watched the cold gray columns advance toward the roost, toward the hatchlings, and he knew his clever tricks had only delayed the ending, not changed it. There was one chance left, and it was a desperate one. The Empire's whole assault was coordinated from a single great command ship that hung in low orbit, the brain behind every machine on the ground. If it fell, the rest would scatter into chaos. But it sat far above the reach of any dragon's flight, behind shields no claw could touch. Daniel looked at his stripped-down shuttle, at its battered power core, and at the last watcher beside him. He had one wild idea, and it would cost almost everything he had left. He turned to the great red dragon, and through the hatchling he laid out the gamble. The last watcher listened. Then it lowered its scarred head and it agreed. The plan was built on the one thing the Empire would never expect, which was that a dragon and a human might fly as one. Daniel could not reach the command ship. No dragon could climb that high alone, into the thin cold air above the world, and even if one could, it would arrive exhausted and slow, an easy kill for the ship's guns. But the last watcher was the strongest flyer in the roost, and Daniel had something the dragons had never had. He had his shuttle's power core, the one piece of his wreck that still held real strength, and he had spent 2 sleepless days turning it into a single brutal weapon, an overloaded charge that would release everything it held in one blast if it struck home. The idea was simple and almost certainly fatal. The last watcher would carry Daniel as high as its great wings could climb, far higher than any dragon had flown in living memory, riding the thin air toward the command ship's blind spot. Daniel would arm the charge. And in the last moment, before the ship's guns could find them, he would deliver it to the one seam in the shields that his scanner had found, a vent where the ship breathed out its heat, the same kind of vent the dragons knew so well from their own worlds. The hatchling did not want him to go. It pressed against him, taller than him now, and in its clear voice it said, "Papa, no, stay." The same words it had once used to ask him to stay forever now begged him not to leave at all. Daniel put his hand on the great green head he had once wrapped in a thermal blanket. "I have to," he said. "If I don't, they take everything, they take you." He looked into the gold eyes. "You stay, you protect the little ones, that's your job now." The hatchling shook, but it understood and it let him go. He climbed onto the last watcher's back, lashed himself down with cable from the wreck, and held the charge against his chest. The great red dragon spread its wings, and it leapt into the sky. The climb was brutal. The air thinned until Daniel's lungs burned and the cold bit through everything. The last watcher's wingbeats grew slower and heavier as it fought higher than it had ever flown, its old scarred body straining. Below them the battle raged across the ridges, fire and gray ships and the small dark shapes of the dragons holding the line. Above them the command ship grew from a distant speck into a vast wall of cold metal, and it had not yet seen them, because no one watched for a dragon coming from straight below, out of the world itself. Then the ship's sensors caught them, and the guns began to turn. The last watcher gave everything it had left. It folded its wings and dove sideways, then beat upward in a final desperate surge, straight at the great vent in the ship's underside that glowed with escaping heat. Fire from the guns tore past them. One blast caught the dragon's wing and Daniel felt the great body shudder, felt them begin to fall. But they were close enough. He cut the cable. He armed the charge. And as the last watcher made one last lunge that brought them into the mouth of the vent, Daniel threw the overloaded core into the burning dark and let go. The blast was a second sun. It tore through the command ship from the inside, ripping along the vents and the seams Daniel had read so carefully, and the great cold wall of metal broke apart in fire. The brain of the assault went silent. Across the ridges, every Empire machine that had hung on its signals froze, blind and stupid and alone. And the dragons, who had been holding on by nothing, fell upon them. Daniel did not see it. He was falling, tumbling through the thin, cold air, the world spinning below him. He had given the dragons their chance, and he had not expected to live to see them take it. Then something caught him. The last watcher, wounded and falling itself, had turned in the air and folded its great body around the small human it had carried. Wrapped in those wings, shielded from the wind, Daniel fell through the burning sky in the arms of a dragon, and together they came down hard but alive on the soft grass of the valley where it had all begun. The Empire broke. With its command ship gone and its machines blind, the cold builders did the one thing they had never done before. They retreated. Their gray columns lifted off the ridges and climbed back into the dark, fleeing a world they had come to clear, beaten by a people they had thought already dead. The dragons did not chase them. They gathered instead around the place where Daniel lay against the wounded last watcher, and the hatchling came running, faster than all the rest, and pressed its head to his chest and would not let go. "Papa," it said, over and over. "Papa." He was hurt, and so was the great red dragon, but they would both heal. The story spread, as stories do. The galaxy learned that the dragon worlds were not what they had believed, that behind the wall of terror lived a dying people who had only ever wanted to be left alone, and that the wall had been broken not by a conqueror, but by a single human who had chosen to stay. The dragons were no longer alone behind their red marks on the chart. Humanity had reached them, and the reaching had not been an act of war or science or pride. It had been an act of one creature, refusing to walk away from another that needed him. Daniel stayed on the ridge world. He watched the hatchling grow into something vast and bright, watched new eggs hatch in the warm hollows, watched the dragons begin slowly to live again instead of merely surviving. And on quiet evenings he sat beside the last watcher under the orange sky, two survivors of different kinds, and looked up at a sky that no longer belonged to fear. The dragons had never been unreachable. They had only been unapproached, and it had taken just one who dared, and one small hatchling who ran to him and called him Papa, to change everything.